Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you today. My name is Ismail Einashe. I'm a journalist and a writer, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel, or rather a conversation today. And my job is just to guide the conversation. I'll ask some questions. We have about an hour, and then we will do maybe 35 minutes at the beginning with our two speakers, and then we'll open up for conversations. So the title of the panel, which you'll be able to see behind us, is called The Displaced, Unplaced Other, and it's really looking into what it feels like to be from a community in a place where there's a sometimes minority, but often a dominant community that often oppresses. So we hear from the example in Brazil and South Africa, and we will try to understand some of the deep-rooted experiences of those who've built homes amidst adversity. Given the profound backgrounds of Brazil and South Africa, our speakers will try to shed light through their work, through their careers, on how they have navigated this dynamic in their works. We'll delve into the complex reality of sharing a home within a historically dominant community that has often imposed its authority violently. And the experiences of groups who have, of course, built these homes with sweat, blood, and tears, but to often be told that they don't belong is, of course, a poignant one. So I'm going to just briefly introduce our panelists. So I've got Masande and Ntshanga is the winner of the 2013 PEN International New Voices Award. He was shortlisted for the Kane Prize for African Writing in 2015. He was born in East London, South Africa. He received a Fulbright Award and a NRF freestanding master scholarship. His debut novel, The Reactive, was published in 2014, followed by two more novels, including Native Life in the Third Millennium, which was published in 2020. Djamila Ribeiro is a public intellectual, writer, philosopher, social justice activist, and one of the most influential leaders in the Afro-Brazilian women's rights movement. She is the author of the book, Who's Afraid of Black Feminism, and she's also a regular columnist for the daily newspaper Folha de Sao Paulo, where she is currently based, one of the most important newspapers in her country. She's also the Marie Claire winner of the Djibouti Award 2020, and she was also awarded the 2019 Prince Claus Award, and I know them very well, and I remember being there actually on that occasion when you awarded that. And that was granted by the Netherlands, and she's also been featured on the BBC's one of the most 100 most influential women globally. So, yes, round of applause. Thank you, yes, I love it, enthusiasm, especially at the back, I'm loving it. Yeah, keep going, yeah? We need more of that. So the first question I really have was just to kind of, to both of you, we talk about the idea and concept and theme of home. That's the theme of this year's Macondo Literary Festival. So how do you both, as writers, as thinkers, as individuals working in your countries, how do you describe and portray home in your writings when you are faced with displacement, denial, and systematic oppression and violence? Djamila, if we start with you in Brazil.
Well, good afternoon. I'm very glad to be here in Kenya for the first time. Thank you all to join us. Well, I think I needed to talk a little bit about Brazil because usually people do not know too much about. Brazil was the last country in America to end slavery and tried to deny the existence of racism in Brazil for a long time. So the racial democracy myth was very present in Brazil and outside Brazil. The idea that people abroad have from Brazil, it's the idea that Brazil is a racial paradise. But actually, Brazil is a very racist country, and Black population in Brazil is the majority of the population. But historically, that country tried to keep us apart from rights. So after the slavery time, they encouraged the immigrant people to come to Brazil to accomplish a whitewashing in politics. After that, they denied any kind of reparation policy for Black people in Brazil. So you can imagine it, because of the miscegenation in Brazil, and the miscegenation is a product of rape of Black women during the slavery time. You cannot have a romantic idea on that. And because of that, a lot of Black people, especially light-skinned Black people, they didn't see themselves as Black in Brazil for a long time. So this was a problem in Brazil because of this idea of, oh, Brazil is not a racist country. Racism is only in South Africa or the United States, places where there were legal apartheid. No, Brazil, it's a paradise. And it was very difficult even to Black people, especially light-skinned Black people, to understand themselves as Black. So the work of the Black movement in Brazil was very important to raise awareness on that, and also to demand public policy for Black people, and to refuse this idea of racial democracy. So for me, that being said, in all these contests, as a little child, a little girl, a little Black girl, dark-skinned girl in Brazil, it was very difficult for me to feel that I belong to that country for a long time. In my family, okay, my parents were Black, my father was an activist, I was raised to be an activist, but I had to go to school. And for me, it was very difficult to understand myself in that place, that I was discriminated, that the history that was told as the history of the European people, the denial of the Black people culture all the time. So for me, home is a place that I had to build. And I feel home in Brazil when I am with people from Candomblé, which is an Afro-Brazilian religion. I'm part of Candomblé. When I am with the women, the Black women of the movement, social movement in Brazil. When I am with people that I can just be myself, I just can be a human being. So I have to create this place. I have to build these places in Brazil to feel home. Because as a Black woman that had the opportunity to study, that had the opportunity to be in certain places, I don't feel home in Brazil many times. So I think home is not a static thing. I think home is a place that you have to build to be able to feel that we belong.
Thank you, very powerful.
Can I get a refresher of the question?
So the question was, how do you describe and portray home in your writings when you're faced with displacement, denial, and violence, just as Djamila was describing in the context of Brazil. So in South Africa, how are you as a novelist, as a writer, thinker, navigating that space when that's the context in South Africa?
Yeah. First of all, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. It's interesting because I think that's one of my main preoccupations actually as a writer. I think the two are very difficult to separate, if at all that's possible. South Africa, as it is now, has fallen under various descriptions. There's this common saying where people kind of refer to it as an open air prison. And I have a novelist friend of mine who describes it as a crime scene, actually. Speaking to how it's still kind of reeling from the moment of colonial contact, which happened in 1652. And for me, the more I've written, the more I've come to think of it as a kind of laboratory, a place that kind of experimented with human beings, with how to organize human beings and societies through both like white supremacy and scientific racism, eugenicism, and all of that. And of course, this begins, again, right at the moment of contact. And then it continues, and this is where my own personal story begins, It's, I was talking to my father the other day, and he's getting older, and I don't know if anyone else's father does this, but the older he gets, for me, he's kind of been begging me to write his story. and I've been telling him that I'm busy with my own books, etc. But you know, one day I kind of decided to indulge him, and I listened to him speak about his parents and his grandparents, and it began a reflection in me, you know, on how the Union of South Africa, for example, was began in 1910, and then 3 years later, when my grandmother would have been about 10 or 11, we had the Native Land Act of 1913. And what this act did was that it made it illegal for natives or black people to acquire or possess any land outside of 1/10 of the territory. So a lot of people were displaced from their ancestral homes and sent to reserves, which were known as homelands back then. And because those homelands were actually economically basically defunct, they were dummy states that were meant to be understood as being black and independent, but it was actually a strategy of divide and conquer, dividing the ethnicities, you know. And as a result, a lot of people had to leave their ancestral homes to go to the cities, to urbanized areas, where most men would work as miners. And just as that happens, there's yet another experiment, you know, which is the passing of the legislature of apartheid in 1948, right, with all its laws. And then after that, yet another experiment, which is the Group Areas Act, which determines spatially where you're allowed to be in the cities that you work in, and how you can't be at a certain place after a certain time. And you're only allowed citizenship in these spaces when you're working for someone white, and so forth, and it continues. And of course there is resistance. We have great philosophers, we have great thinkers, you know, writers that predate me, like Steve Biko, who comes up with the technology of Black consciousness, a way of not only fighting the legislature, but also fighting the damage that white supremacy has done on the native population. And then later on, there's Nelson Mandela with his version of humanism, another form of technology. And so for me, it's almost like home has always been disrupted, right? Our history is something that I've always experienced as a continuum that begins right at the moment of colonial contact, through apartheid, the post-apartheid era, and even with the student protests now, you know, which arise in 2015, where students feel affronted by the preservation of colonial monuments in our universities, and also how exclusionary the fee policies are. And it continues on that way. So I think my understanding of home has been this contentious, fractured laboratory. And my goal as a novelist, as a writer, is to have a perspective that reaches from the margins to the center and kind of understands this ever-shifting experiment that is this territory on the southernmost tip of Africa.
Djamila, do you want to respond to any of those points, or should I continue? Okay. Well, I guess the question that I was going to ask to follow up, you've kind of already, Masande went there, which is this idea of how do you cope as a writer navigating the space of historic violence? And in places like South Africa, you've just given us this amazing kind of summary of the history of the country in a sense, and your kind of connection to that as a writer. And also you just discussed, Djamila, this context in Brazil. So how do you as writers navigate a space when there is this, not just dislocation and displacement, but there's this active denial and systems of oppression? How do you as writers begin the actual journey of crafting that into your stories? And how does that manifest also, second part to this is, in yourself? How do you also emotionally experience this?
I think my strategy has always been to begin with human beings. There's something quite alarming and startling to experience when you actually see one of these dome buses like locked away somewhere in a cabinet from this area and from this time in history where people needed documented permission, to exist. And as much as those documents and these monuments last, there's also an intergenerational trauma that's also been following these changes in history. So I've found that as an artist, as a writer first, and someone who, kind of trails on the heels of scholars and historians, picking up what I can, my project is preoccupied with the human being, first of all. And I find that the deeper you go into the human being in South Africa, the more history begins to reveal itself. That your grandmother carries things, your mother carries things, and even I carry things that my nieces do not know. For example, being born in one of these homelands during a state of emergency, experiencing my mother's anxiety of police raids, being warned that there were bombs that were stored in loaves of bread that were left on the side of the road. And it has a psychic life that persists, So I'm able to access that history through the people that populate this land, which is actually very interesting because when the colonists arrived, that was the least of their concerns. The place was very beautiful on the surface and very rich in the minerals. And even the early literature of South Africa, is very reflective of the beauty of the land, as if they found it completely devoid of human life. So that's how I do it. I do it through the human being first.
Well, for me, I think it's a different process because, I am 43 years old and my first book was published when I was 37. So I was raised in a family that I had the opportunity to read. My father used to read to us. I am a writer because I have the opportunity to read. And when I was 19 years old, I worked in a Black women organization in Santos, the city that I was born, the city of, it's in the seaside of São Paulo. And there was a library called Carolina Maria de Jesus. Carolina Maria de Jesus, she was one of the biggest writers in Brazil. And she was a Black woman that she was born in a favela in Brazil. And she became one of the most important writers in Brazil. And in that library, I knew who Carolina Maria de Jesus was, and I said, wow. And there were a lot of books written by Black women. And that moment for me, when I was 19 years old, was very important to understand that, wow, Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and Lélia Gonzalez, Sueli Carneiro, several Afro-Brazilian writers. And for me, that space was very powerful to understand that I could write. But I had some, my mom passed away when I was 20 years old, and my father passed away when I was 21. And it was very difficult to deal with the grief and all that things. And me and my brothers, we had to, to live and to understand what we are going to do. And so the difficulty of the life made me put off my dream to write. So I had to deal with, I needed to survive. And after that, I married with my first husband and I was pregnant. I was studying in a private university in Santos, and then I decided to quit. And then I came back studying when I was 28 years old. When I started studying philosophy in the Federal University of São Paulo due to the important public policy in terms of education, especially in the first Lula administration. And I was 28 years old, my daughter was 3 years old. When I finished my graduation, I was 32 years old, and then I started my the master degree, and I finished my dissertation when I was 35. So I think it's important to say that because as a Black woman in Brazil, most of us, especially the women from my generation, we had to postpone what we wanted to do because we have to deal with the life, the difficulties and the oppression, a lot of things. And for me, it was very important not for me, it was very important to continue dreaming. And so when I finished my dissertation, I was 35 years old. I was writing to some newspapers in Brazil, and I decided to use my visibility to create a project, an editorial project. Because to study philosophy in Brazil is to study the thought of white men, European white man thinkers. And it was very difficult to me to deal with that environment. It was very difficult. So when I was 35, I decided I had to do something because until 2016 in Brazil, the books that were published, 90% were written by white people. 90%, 70% men and 20% women until 2016. So in 2017, I decided to create a project to publish Black people. So my first book, Lugar de Fala, a place of speech or where we stand, the translation that my editor thought was better, was published in 2017, but in a collective project. So I published it myself and I published other authors, Black authors, in this project. And then when I did that, a big publishing house decided to invite me to write. So I had to publish myself first, but in a collective project. So I wrote 3 books for this big publishing house, but I continue running this project. Until today, we have already published 25 books written by Black people. It's an independent project. So for me to fulfill this gap, and it was important to publish, but not to be alone. And also to be part of a collective. So I've published people that are very different from me because I think it's important also to present the diversity of Black people. And also it was a way, it was a revenge for me because it was very difficult to study in that university, all the things that I have to deal with. So yes, I am going to publish Black people because, you are in Brazil, you are the majority of the population, and we cannot continue doing that. So this project was very important because we impacted the editorial market in Brazil, and now in Brazil they are publishing more Black people. And for me, it's a way to fulfill this gap, but also it's a way, to revenge the other things that as a Black woman you have to deal. But it's not easy, because we are in Brazil and they don't. Sometimes you have to deal with a lot of attacks because people, they don't want to recognize that what we are doing. But I think it's important to hack the system. So I had to study the editorial market, and then we organized book launches in several places of Brazil because Brazil is a huge country. So we decided to travel and to talk to people. We decided to organize events in public equipment, in public places. We decided to create a way to democratize the books. And we did that in Brazil, and it was very important. This project is very important. And now I want to translate people from the Global South. We translated an Afro-Colombian writer this year. Next year, we're going to publish a book written by Dalit women from India, because I think you have to refuse this epistemological dependence of the Global North. And we need to also to confront the politics of translations, because the politics of translations are very colonial. Because I write in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese, it's very difficult to get our work recognized outside Brazil. But to finish, we are we have an internationalization project because until today we have already published 6 authors in French, 3 authors in Italian, and 3 authors in Spanish, because we want to be able to present the Afro-Brazilian intellectual outside Brazil. And for us, it's very important also to fight for translations, and that's what we are doing there. So for me, writing and publishing is a collective thing. And I continue writing my books, but I continue publishing other Black authors in Brazil. And maybe I want to publish people from Kenya.
Yes.
Maybe I want to publish, people from South Africa, yes, because we have this project to translate people from the Global South. Just to end, women, we are not old to do the things that we've dreamed of. We are not old to that. I'm 43 years old, and I think it's important to us as women not to give up.
I think round of applause for that. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question which follows up on this idea of you were talking about, Djamila, about writing as an act of resistance, as an act of revenge, as an act of getting stories out into the public sphere because these stories are invincible. I'm going to come to you in a second, but I just want to ask a little bit of a follow-up question to you directly, saying a bit more about your work on the Afro-Brazilian women's movement, and particularly, I remember reading stuff from you in 2017, Bolsonaro, the whole era, and of course the tragic murder of Marielle Franco. And I just want to ask you, if you could comment on what the experiences of Afro-Brazilian women has been, and also what's happening now, because of course there's a new president, Lula's back. What's the situation for women at the moment in Brazil?
Well, Bolsonaro was defeated, but Bolsonarismo not, because it's very present in the Brazilian society, unfortunately. It's very difficult to deal with all this toxic environment now in Brazil because Bolsonaro, he's still very popular. And even in the favelas and poor communities, he's a popular man, and it's terrible. But I think now that Lula is back, of course, we can breathe democracy again. Of course, it's better for us, but you have now to rebuild what Bolsonaro destroyed in these 4 years, and it was very difficult to do, especially for us Black and indigenous people in Brazil, because I think it's very important to talk about indigenous people as well. So after Marielle Franco murder, that was very hard to us. I knew Marielle, and for me it was very difficult to deal with that. All the fear that we Black women were feeling in Brazil, because it was a message for us. You know, you cannot be here and you cannot confront what you were doing. It was very difficult to us to deal. But I think it's very important also to say that there is a lot of resistance in Brazil. There is the Black movement in Brazil is fighting for our rights. The Black women's movement are organizing themselves to be in the politics, and I think it's very important to support Black women in this kind of places. There are Black women in the editorial marketing trying to make changes. There are Black women and filmmakers trying to create new possibilities of existence for us Black people. There is a diversity of this movement, and I think it's very important to say, because usually people think Brazilian people is a very passive people that you don't know anything, and there are a lot of resistance in Brazil. And I think that now you have to deal with Bolsonarismo. We cannot expect too much from Lula administration now, because Lula, to win, he had to do a lot of alliances with people from different perspectives, and we have to deal now with that. But to finish, I think that the importance of the work of Candomblé in Brazil, and Candomblé is a religion mostly led by women, historically, and how these places in Brazil were important to us as Black people to give us a sense of a community, to be able to feel our spirituality, and also to give us back our humanity. So Candomblé also, I think it's a very important space because it's not only about religion, it's also about resistance, about to make us feel human, to make us understand the power of our God and our goddess, and how it's important to us to be in a community to confront the system, because we need spaces to take care of ourselves, to finish. Because the mental health, it's an issue that you have to talking about. And a lot of Black women in Brazil historically, they were mentally ill because of the racism, the sexism, and all these violences. And I think now the Black women in Brazil, they are being able to create these places that we can take care of ourselves. And I think it's very, very important to talk about mental health. And you need mental health to deal with Bolsonaro and what Bolsonaro did in Brazil, because it's not easy when you see a person like you, Black like you, supporting Bolsonaro. It's difficult to deal with the fact that you go to a favela, there is a guy there supporting Bolsonaro. Because, you know, in a favelas, you have a church and a bar, a church and a bar, a church and a bar. And these churches, they do the work that the states are not doing. And this is the problem. These evangelicals, yes, and they have TV in Brazil. They have a political project. They are congressmen, they are mayors, they are governors, and they are very organized. And they go to favelas because people are so, needing a lot of things. And no, God, you help you and come here, but vote for Bolsonaro. This is a problem. And I think in Brazil, we need to come back to do this kind of work, the work in a basis, because it's impossible to change the society without that. And when you come to Brazil, please go to São Paulo and visit the place that I founded last year. I have an institute, and there we provide legal and psychological assistance mostly for Black women, but it's open for everyone. And because I think it's important to us as Black women to organize ourselves in a way that you can provide change for our community.
Thank you. Yeah, round of applause. I'm going to ask a couple more brief questions, and then we'll open up for questions. But now I want to ask specific questions to Masande in South Africa. So South Africa approaches the 30th anniversary next year of the transition to democracy. How do young South Africans born after that event, how do they navigate that new space? I mean, what do they feel about the country now? I mean, 30 years, a lot's happened. And how do you, as a writer, tell that sort of story? How do you navigate that kind of landscape?
Yeah. Like I referred to earlier, right, we kind of experience this history as a continuum. Even as we approach, this anniversary, there are still a lot of problems that afflict, the Black majority, which still lives under poverty, extreme poverty, despite a Black post-liberation government. And that's also kind of been the story of the region. You topple over one regime, and then you realize that the problem actually is that coloniality persists, the way that the society is still arranged. It's just manned by different people. And each progressive movement seems to have its own limitations after a while, and what we're experiencing now, for example, is it's been very important for people that land is restored to the native population, because land for us is more than just a material resource. It's also ancestral. There's a spiritual connection to it. And so that is something that might not align itself with nationalism. But, and people will love hearing about things going public and nationalized. But then there is now another generation which is looking for a more intersectional approach to oppression, right? And they're introducing queer activists who now find themselves on the other side of the most progressive group, that precedes them. So it's still very much fractured. It's still very much being experimented on. And unfortunately, because we have inherited this really brutal system in how it deals with human beings and how it deals with the environment. The country continues to be in decline. So it's bittersweet. On one hand, we really commend those who have fought in the past, but we're also faced with other struggles in the future, you know, and that's kind of part of what motivated my second novel, which was a work of speculative fiction that kind of posited this idea that what is the logical conclusion of late-stage capitalism in South Africa if the West is now looking to us for resources, not just minerals, but in terms of data? And if we comply with that, what are the consequences for our people and for our land, you know? And through that, I didn't necessarily come to an answer, but I was glad that I was able to illuminate a lot of questions. And I think South Africa, in order for it to survive, has to be a place that continuously evolves, that continuously expands its movements to include those of us who are most marginalized, you know. And to go back again to Steve Biko, you know, one of the famous quotes that he says is that in the end, what he hoped to do was to bestow on South Africa a more human face. And that still remains, you know, our goal. And as a writer, my role is to be there, to listen to all voices, and to challenge power even when it's not convenient, even when it seems pessimistic, and also to locate us within the global conversation as well, just as we're having foreign entities coming in to make use of our resources. It's important that we're critical of those foreign entities and also critical of the people who grant them access to something that's finite and in the end cannot be replaced.
Thank you. A round of applause. I see more people are coming in, which is fabulous. I'm going to ask two more questions, and then we can open up for questions. So we've spoken a lot about violence, historic, contemporary, dealing with that, navigating that as writers, both of you from Brazil and South Africa, and also dealing with stories in storytelling when histories are denied, when people are denied, when people are made invincible, when there is violence on a regular basis, and dealing with that individually, but also collectively. But what about that space beyond trauma? And I think you've already touched upon this, about resilience, about hope. Djamila, you've been talking about revenge, but also as an act of resistance, as an act of claiming yourself and claiming your space and saying, I'm Afro-Brazilian, I'm a woman, I'm here. And you've been describing just now, Masande, about the experience in South Africa and how those old wounds of colonialism and violence still are very much intertwined in your own family. You talk about your father and your grandmother. So how do you, as writers in your work, depict stories of resilience and hope? And how do you navigate that space? And is it important to ensure that we're not always telling stories of trauma, that people are more than just the sum of their trauma? How do we have that space for resilience and kind of humanity?
I mean, I think that's incredibly important. And that's where, for me, as far as art goes, I think the imagination itself, you know, can be a revolutionary force. Because after, you know, the wars have been won, we're going to have to imagine new societies and new ways of being and new ways of relating to each other. And I think one of the things that are really helpful in establishing that is being able to listen, again, to our young people and to the people who are most marginalized, so that we can actually synthesize all of these alternative knowledge systems, bring them into the center, destabilize the center actually, get rid of the hierarchy, have a more horizontal way of thinking, or as we say, Ubuntu, you know, which emphasizes human connectedness and inclusion, and to actually like legitimize that and center it in a society, view it not only as a philosophy, but as a technology, you know, and so that's what I try to introduce in my speculative work as well, it isn't just about thinking about what the post-human is or the singularity. It's also about how these future societies will be organized. And in fact, it might turn out that a pre-colonial tool like Ubuntu is actually the future of humankind, for all we know. Yeah?
Well, I am a nonfiction writer, so I decided to write about these issues because I think it's very important. But also I am a human being, and I think that sometimes in Brazil, people only expect us to talk about pain or to talk about difficult things. And I think it's very important to us as Black people not to be fixed in this position. And so I have a weekly column in Folha de São Paulo, which is the most important newspaper in Brazil. And there I try to write about the things that I like to do. I try to write about other things because I think it's very important to us to do that because, I don't know here, but in Brazil, social media are very popular, very, very popular. And sometimes something happens and people write to me, aren't you going to talk about this? You have to talk about this, you have to do this all the time. And then sometimes we think that you have to do that. So, but you don't have to do that, because I think I do a lot of things. Now I don't want to talk about that because I am watching TV with my daughter and I am a human being, I'm a mother. I have to go to the supermarket, to buy groceries for my house. I have a lot of things to do. And I think it's very important to us not to be fixed in this kind of condition because the other is still imposing who you have to be. And for me, it was important to heal myself when I understood that I had to heal myself. You have to admit that you have to deal with our traumas because, my mom, she passed away when she was 51 years old. She was very young. And for me, it's very important to think about that yes, my mom, she didn't have the opportunity to heal herself because she was a domestic worker, then she married my father and she had 4 children. And it's very important to us to think about that as Black people, you are not here to attend other people's things. And that we have to build our history, have the right to create different possibilities of existence, that I am a human being. And sometimes in Brazil, I don't know, I am in a bar because I like to drink, because especially in Brazil, it's very important. You cannot live without drink. I'm joking. But I like in the weekends. And sometimes I'm there, drinking, having fun, because I'm a very funny person. And
dancing, I hope.
Yes, yeah. And try to dance and to think, wow, this was a very difficult week. Now I want to, And somebody approached me, hello, Djamila. And I say, oh, hello. Yeah, Djamila, racism in Brazil. And I was like, yes, racism in Brazil is a problem. And now I want to drink. And that's it, because I am a human being. And I think it's very important to us to say, I don't want to talk about that now. Buy my book, So we have to understand that you are not here to attend what other people think that you have to. And you are here also to be happy, and Candomblé taught me that. You have to celebrate, you have to understand that you have to find joy in your life. And a happy Black person is a revolutionary act. In a society that tries to destroy you all the time, that say that you are ugly, that you are not worthy, and you look to yourself and say, yes, I am worthy, I am beautiful, and I'm intelligent, this is revolutionary. And I think it's important not to let the racism win. I am a human being and I have the right to be happy. I have the right to be loved and I have the right just to be. because I don't want to be in spaces that people think that you are here because you have to attend what you want. No, I am here because I want to be here. And you have to find this path for us to be and to understand that it's a way to live our humanity.
Beautiful. Round of applause. Okay, that just brings me to the last question, very brief question. So this session is a conversation we just had, brilliant conversation. It can go on for hours. I'm just like on my, so excited to listen to you both. But of course, it's also a conversation we just mentioned between Brazil and South Africa. And I was wondering, are there shared experiences, of course, maybe challenges or perhaps lessons that you can learn from each other, from the context in South Africa and from the context in Brazil? Is there something that you experience you might want to bring up?
I have been in South Africa, yes, in 2019. And it was a very important experience for me because when I arrived in the airport, everybody was black. And for me, it was like, because in Brazil, it's not like that. And I was outdoor, everybody was black. And here in Kenya, the same. Wow, everybody's black. And in the airport and everybody, because in Brazil it's not like that. Women like me, they are cleaning the airport. And for me it was like, wow, in South Africa. And the way South Africa, they are working on memory. Because in Brazil, they try to erase the memory. You don't have a museum like you have, the apartheid museum, and for me it was a very important experience. In the Robben Island, the guides, they were people who were incarcerated with Mandela there, so he can explain to you the history. And in Brazil, I think they try to erase the memory. They destroyed all documents related to the slavery time. So I don't know if my ancestors came from Nigeria or if they came from, I don't know, Guinea-Bissau, because they tried to erase the memory. And for me in South Africa, it was very important to see what happened. Because if you don't remember, you are going to repeat. And in Brazil, they are repeating all the time because they try to avoid the conversation. Until today in Brazil, any military man in the dictatorship, during the dictatorship, was condemned in Brazil, any of them. Until today, there are people in Brazil denying the dictatorship. You don't have a museum telling the people what that dictatorship was. So for me, in South Africa, it was a profound experience because the way, it was my vision, of course, you were working on memory there. And to tell people, this happened. All this violence happened. And you needed to see what happened. So I think Brazil have a lot to learn with South Africa in these terms. And it's a shame that in Brazil we are still struggling to tell people that slavery time was not a romantic thing. And still, of course, you are managing to do that in Brazil, but you need people, to keep the memory alive. People needed to be ashamed of what happened. And in South Africa, for me, it was a very profound experience in this sense. So you have to come to Brazil and to say what you think.
I have to. Thank you for that.
Do you want to, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think just from my knowledge of the country, really, and my understanding of conquest and how white supremacy works, because we also do have miscegenation, but the difference being that apartheid laws had very strict categories in terms of who fit where, and it was a legal process. And I really love that you're able to pick up on the commemoration. And I think it's bittersweet in some ways because, one, we don't forget, but two, it's also a living history. Our society is still arranged alongside racialized capitalism, with still a presence, despite the Black majority of white supremacy, which is interesting because you can have all of these instruments that are in place. And some of these institutions are even run by people who are, white. And you would imagine that they understand. But when you delve deeper into their social lives, they actually propagate some of the same ills. So I think what we would probably have to learn the most from you, that we do just to reinforce it, is more on the ground work and more conversation, just socially, just instead of just leaving it to institutions.
I have a question for you. What did you think about the Trevor Noah book? Trevor Noah book? What did you think about?
We have time.
I have not read
Didn't
the
read.
Trevor Noah book.
Nice try, Djamila. Nice try.
Nice one. Nice one.
All right, I think that's the end, but I've got time for questions now. So there's, I can see a hand up already, excited. So many. Okay, we're going to take 3 questions. So you and this lady at the front and the gentleman at the back. Yeah. If you just say your name, that'd be lovely as well.
Thank you. My name is Haingo Kwemba. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Haingo Kwemba. I work with the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation as a journalist. Djamila, I love the idea when you spoke of writing as a form of resistance. It reminded me of many years ago, over 10 years ago, I was in Egypt attending a writers' forum. It was called The African Writer and the Challenges of the Time. And there was a professor of political science who came to speak to the writers there. And he spoke of writing as a form of rebellion, that writing is an act of rebellion. Writing is an act of subversion. Writing, after all, is an act of protest. And it reminded me that even those many years ago when Chinua Achebe and his generation of writers were writing, they were actually writing to debunk what has been told about the African, the denigration, that the stories that had been told about Africa by the explorer and the colonialist. And so for me, I come from that school, that writing, after all, is an act of protest, especially in societies where we still have this continuation of the hegemony, the discourses of hegemony. And I guess it's not just in Brazil. In most African societies, we still have those hegemonic discourses where ethno-political elites take over, the instruments of power, and they dominate the rest of the populace. So that is something that will still apply even to a Kenyan or a Ugandan or a Rwandese or a Guinean. And I also love my brother from South Africa when he spoke of, for example, for him, he spoke of South Africa has been described as an open prison. And for him, he enters into writing as a novelist, South Africa as a crime scene, and also as a laboratory where they're, testing how to organize people. Again, it resonates with all places. Yeah, so I think
Yes.
wonderful discussions.
Thank you. No, it's the lady at the front. You're going to get the next question. Do you want to answer his question, or should we take? Yeah. Okay. Let's take the question, and then we'll do the first 2.
You spoke about trying to write from a place and create from a place that's not just centered around pain and suffering, but what about the actual hunger and appetite that's out there when it comes to what audience or what a publisher is wanting to have be published, have be told when you're invited to come speak? How does it not just become about bearing your pain and suffering for an audience? And if that hunger is not there already, how do you shift that at the audience level and not just at the what you're putting out there level?
Sure. You resist it. I guess you resist it in the work, and you also resist it in how you talk about the work. Because there is something, if I'm getting your question correctly, quite dehumanizing, about making a commodity out of people's pain. And part of the project that I believe that we're both involved in is a project to humanize, actually. So I think it's just a matter of active resistance. finding out the ways in which it's trying to be extractive and outsmarting it and kind of preempting that in a way. And yeah, I think for me, it's about taking what is typically understood to be marginal and material for people in the center to spectate and actually forcing it into a place where it's central in the discourse. And the perspective is actually from that point of view rather than from the center looking at the other.
I answered her question. Of course, it's a challenge. For me, in the beginning, was very difficult sometimes to say no, because you think, oh, if I say no, people are not going to invite me anymore. And I think in the beginning, we feel that fear, but it's important to transcend that, because otherwise, people you put you in that place and that's it. And beyond that, I think you needed to create the spaces that we believe collectively. And I think it's important to be engaged with other Black people, other Black women, to try to think what you can do. And in Brazil, there are very important experiences of girls in favelas that organized the groups and decided to talk about what they want to talk. And I think it's very important. The way out for me is the collective work, because sometimes alone you cannot confront that.
Okay, and the gentleman's question was about writing as a form of resistance. Do you have any comment on that? He was talking about your...
Yes, I agree. For me, it's a way of resistance, but also it's a way to, humanize myself. I think it's, of course, it's about resistance, because you were talking about societies that were very oppressive societies, and to be a Black person who writes is already an active of resistance. But I don't think that all writers have to write about the same thing. I think I'm a non-fiction writer, so I write about system of oppression. But I do love to read Black people who write about, poetry and write about other things, not necessarily related to the oppression system, because I think just to be a Black person doing that is an act of resistance.
Question from you, sir?
Yeah, hi. My name is Unene. Thank you both to you for your time, your experiences, your insights that you're sharing with us. My question is for you, Djamila. You made a very powerful point about the politics of translation being colonial politics. I know this year there was a translation that just came out of Mario de Andrade's Macunaíma. And I would want to hear from you about whether you think that the translation of, works by a light-skinned author like de Andrade from the Modernismo era is something that complicates the narrative of Brazil as this racial democracy, or do you think that contemporary works by Brazilians would better serve the work of challenging that narrative and deconstructing it? I guess I'm asking is if you think in the 21st century there is still a place for Macunaíma and what it has to talk about Brazil. Thank you.
Well, of course, Mário de Andrade, he was a very important Brazilian figure. I think it's important, and I think to understand his context, the time that he wrote about that. And I'm not, I think that you needed to read Macunaíma in Brazil, even to criticize and to understand the time. I'm not, that person, no, let's not read that book. I think it's important. The thing is, the problem is not Macunaíma being translated. For me, the problem is that the market still do not translate all the diversity of Black people in Brazil. So for me, this is the problem, because they still want to impose one narrative about Brazil. They insist in this narrative. And that the narrative in Brazil is very diverse. And I think that the editorial market is not concerned about that. And in Brazil, there are a lot of thinkers, left-wing thinkers, that still try to maintain this idea of racial democracy, white people. So they are very progressive, but they don't understand racism as a system. They still try to keep this idea of racial democracy. It's very difficult to deal with the left-wing people in Brazil. We vote for them, but it's very difficult to deal with the racism and the way they still want to keep this idea of mixed Brazil, and that does not exist. And these people, generally, these people have the spaces to talk and to be published. This is the thing. And the editorial market still ignore what we Black people are doing. And I'm talking about people, not me, people elder than me. Lélia Gonzalez, for example, and Abdias do Nascimento, who was a very important intellectual, Afro-Brazilian intellectual. I'm talking about Kabengele Munanga, who is from Congo, but he's a professor in Brazil that was very important to confront the idea of racial democracy. And people don't know about these people. Kabengele Munanga, Lélia Gonzalez, Abdias do Nascimento, people who are very important. And so the problem for me is not to publish Macunaíma. The problem is continue to ignore the very rich work of Afro-Brazilian thinkers in Brazil. And again, we speak Brazilian Portuguese. Only Brazil speaks this language, because we don't speak the Portuguese from Portugal, for example. And I was in Portugal this year for the first time, and for me it was a very interesting experience to go to the country of the colonizer. And it's interesting how they are very bothered in Portugal about the fact that a lot of children are learning Brazilian Portuguese because of the internet. And they are very mad about that, because they say that you don't speak the right Portuguese, because it's not European Portuguese. And there are a lot of Brazilian people there now. It's the, a colonization of Brazil in Portugal. And 700,000 of Brazilian people there. And they are very bothered about that. And even in Portugal, they still resist to publish sometimes Brazilian writers, because they are very bothered about the fact of the language. So to think in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese, it's very difficult to be translated. People still think that Brazil is the place of carnival and soccer. When I travel abroad, people ask me if I'm Brazilian. I am Brazilian. Oh, dance samba. This is the idea that people have from Brazil. And sometimes for me, it's very difficult to deal with people in Europe and even in South America, in Argentina and other countries, because they don't know anything about Brazil. And we want to show this Brazil, this Black Brazil. They tried to deny the Black Brazil. But actually, Brazil is a piece of Africa. Brazil is Black. The Black culture in Brazil is the culture that people travel to see. What is samba, carnival, the food? Only Black culture. And they try to deny what you have the best in Brazil. So I think you are still struggling for that. I cannot criticize Mário de Andrade too much, because it's Brazil, it's like, oh my God. But the problem is not that. The problem for me is still this blindness about what you are doing in Brazil.
Thank you, Djamila. I think we only have a few minutes left, so really it's basically one final question. I'll go to the front. Yes, the mic is coming. And then we'll get brief answers. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Christina. I have a question for Djamila. It's about two things you mentioned, candomblé and the influence of the evangelical churches. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the relationship between, or about the power the evangelical churches is gaining at the moment. in relation to candomblé?
Well, the sad thing about that is that the black religion in Brazil is not candomblé, it's the evangelical. There are a lot of black people in the evangelical churches in Brazil today because the candomblé, umbanda, the Afro-Brazilian religions in Brazil were historically marginalized, demonized. So sometimes people are afraid of candomblé. They are afraid of our God and our goddess because historically the colonization put in their heads that candomblé was a bad thing. So, and the evangelical church, they have a political power in Brazil. They are present in the politics. They have a TV channel in Brazil, Record. It's a TV channel, and run by a church, the Universal Church. And it's quite immoral in Brazil because, you know, there is not a terreiro, Afro-Brazilian religion, that have a TV channel in Brazil, for example. And so you have to deal with all these facts. We have to fight for the democratization of media in Brazil. Because until today, media in Brazil is a monopoly. Few families control the media in Brazil. You don't have a democratic media. So you have some TV channels and radios and newspapers controlled by few families. So how you are going to confront this narrative if you don't have the media, if you don't have the ways to do that? So it's very difficult. And the church, they are very present in favelas in Brazil because, you know, people are there living in a very difficult reality, and then I don't know, the priests go there and say, I'm going to help you, and people are there, black men who lives in favelas, and we know that the police violence against black men in Brazil, it's huge. And sometimes if the guy, he is in the church with his Bible, maybe in the favela, the policeman will not stop him because he is with the Bible. So it's very difficult to deal with all these things in Brazil. I think things are started to change, but otherwise the Bolsonaro administration was very damaged for that because he used this kind of discourse that God and you have to kill all the bad guys, you have to arm the population, you have to fight against, you know, people who live in favelas. It's very difficult to deal when people are there in favelas, they don't have nothing, and in the other way, they are watching TV, and we don't have a very public education in elementary schools and high schools. The universities, public universities in Brazil are the best, but you don't have a good education, people are starving, so how to deal with that? So it's very difficult. The evangelical church, they have too much power, and they are fighting against the black movement, the feminist movement. It's very difficult. But it's not about sad stories. I think, on the other hand, you have more black people now in university due to, especially because of the first and second Lula administration, there were affirmative actions in Brazil. There were public policy in terms of education. You have more black people being educated. You have more black people denouncing. You have more black people that are public figures in Brazil, and you are resistant. And candomblé today in Brazil, people are more, you know, talking more about candomblé. I talk about candomblé in my social media, and sometimes people, because I think it's important to people to understand and accept that I am a woman from candomblé. I'm not going to hide it anymore. And today in Brazil, a lot of public figures are talking about that. And it's very important that these people to talk about that. Even white people, because there are a lot of white people in candomblé today in Brazil. And I think that's not a problem for white people to be in candomblé. The problem is only to go to candomblé and not to fight against racism. This is the problem. Because sometimes people, they want to go to candomblé and to listen to samba and to go to Rio de Janeiro, no, Carnival, but they don't want to stand up for the black people. They want to use the black culture, but they don't want to fight for the black rights. So, yeah, and I think this is the problem in Brazil. The white people is still denying that they are part of the problem, that the racism was created by white people, and they have the power to change that, but they still want to go to candomblé and to say that I'm not a racist and that's it. So to end, I think we have a long journey in Brazil. You have to face what Bolsonaro did in the past 4 years and have to continue fighting. They don't have any options until to continue fighting, try to raise awareness to people that they cannot vote for that people. It's a long journey because Brazil is a very complex country.
Thank you very much. That's the end of our session. Please give a big round of applause.